On New Year's Eve 1997, Guy Wallace was working as a bartender at the Furneaux Lodge, a 100-year-old bar in Marlborough Sounds in New Zealand. After his shift, he made his way out to the dock to act as a water taxi for the drunken partygoers. Among the 5 passengers in his boat were 21-year-old Ben Smart and 17-year-old Olivia Hope. They were friends that had been celebrating New Year's all night, after arriving earlier on a chartered yacht called the Tamarack, which they wanted to ride back to in order to get some sleep. However, upon arrival, they found that all the berths were taken and they had nowhere to sleep. Ben and Olivia hopped back on Wallace's boat to find another location to rest. During this trip, a man riding with them in the boat offered to take them back to his yacht and let them get some shut-eye. The friends eagerly agreed, not wanting to spend the whole night searching. Around 4 a.m., Guy Wallace dropped off the 3 passengers at the man's yacht. Ben Smart and Olivia Hope were never seen alive again, sparking one of the most controversial investigations in New Zealand's history. On January 2, 1998, Ben and Olivia's parents filed missing persons reports, sparking an investigation into their disappearance. Lead investigator Rob Pope started in the most obvious place, the last person to see them both alive, water taxi driver Guy Wallace. Wallace told police that the mystery man in his boat was the same man he had waited on earlier that night in the Furneaux Lodge. He described the man as 5'9", with a wiry build and short, wavy dark hair. He said the man had a scruffy appearance with about 2 days' worth of beard growth on his face. He also mentioned that the man had hooded eyes. Police showed Wallace a montage of photos of various people, including a man named Scott Watson. Wallace said that he did not believe anyone in the photos was the mystery man in his boat. However, the police had a trick up their sleeves. They showed a similar montage to Wallace, but this time they switched out Scott Watson's normal photo with one of him with his eyes half shut. Believing this was the normal face of the man and recognizing the hooded eyes, he said this may be the mystery man from the boat. He did comment on the man in the picture looking too tidy and his hair was too short, but this was enough for police to focus in on Scott Watson. The next thing police questioned Wallace about was the yacht that he dropped Ben and Olivia off at. Wallace gave a report of the boat, saying it was made of timber and had a thick blue stripe on the hull. He also drew a picture and wrote 38 to 40 foot ketch and underlined the word ketch twice. A ketch is a 2-masted sailboat. The next person police interrogated was Watson himself, but it was more of a distraction, because 1 week into the investigation, on January 12th, while Watson was being interviewed, police seized his boat, the Blade. They also executed search warrants on Watson's sister's and parents' houses at the same time. Police also tapped Watson's phone lines between February 1998 and the trial, although no incriminating evidence was found. So why all this focus on someone that only may be the mystery man? Well, in the words of lead investigator Rob Pope, Watson stood out like a dog's balls and had the right sort of agenda and pedigree. This was apparently in reference to Watson's past criminal record. Over his teenage years, he had accrued 48 criminal convictions and was in prison twice, in 1989 and 1990. However, Watson had cleaned up his act in his 20s, only having 1 conviction in the time between getting out of jail and the disappearance of Ben and Olivia. Police brought charges against Scott Watson, and after months of investigation, during which no bodies were ever found, the trial started on June 10, 1999. The prosecution brought almost 500 witnesses to testify during the trial. Among them was Don Anderson, another water taxi driver. Anderson claimed that he dropped Watson off at his boat between 2 and 4 a.m. Witnesses from the neighboring boats confirmed they were woken up around this time, as Watson wanted to continue the party into the early hours of the morning. But here's where it gets strange. Prosecution then states that Watson made a trip back to shore, but could not explain how since he didn't take his boat. The reason they were so sure is that eyewitnesses reported seeing Watson in an altercation on shore around 3:30 a.m. According to prosecution, it didn't matter how Watson got back to shore, since there were eyewitnesses that saw him there. They then state that Watson probably undocked his boat around 6 a.m. and dropped the bodies in the Cook Strait, even though no bodies were ever found. Later that day, around 5 p.m., witnesses reported seeing the Blade, Watson's boat, arrive in Erie Bay, and that Watson was the only person aboard. Aside from all that, there were two main pieces of evidence that the prosecution's case revolved around. The first piece was given by two witnesses, yet more circumstantial evidence. Two prisoners testified that they had met and known Watson during his stay in prison as he was being held for trial. Both inmates claimed that Watson confessed to the murders in jail. All of this evidence was circumstantial so far. The first piece of hard evidence they found was in Watson's boat. After seizing the blade, they found the interior had been freshly cleaned and painted, an act police saw as extremely suspicious. The second piece of evidence was found during the seizure of Watson's boat. A blanket was found with hairs on it. Police sent the sample to a forensic biologist for DNA testing, and one of the hairs came back as a match for Olivia Hope. This was a bombshell. DNA evidence is almost impossible to come back from. And after 11 weeks of the trial, Scott Watson was convicted of 2 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum sentence of 17 years. Immediately after the verdict was read, Watson turned to the jurors and said, "You're wrong." As you can already tell, there was hardly any real evidence against Scott Watson. It was mostly eyewitness reports, barring a couple pieces of evidence. So now let's look at each piece of evidence and see how reasonable they are. First is Guy Wallace's interrogation. In it, he identified Watson as possibly the mystery man from the boat. However, he later said that police misled him after finding out they switched the normal photo with the blink photo. He also said he felt tremendous pressure from police and the media during the investigation. He later recanted his identification of Scott Watson. Furthermore, another bartender, Roz McNeely, who was working that night, also identified Watson through his blink photo and also recanted her identification after finding out about the photo swap. Next, we'll look at the identification of Watson's yacht. Wallace described the boat as a ketch, which has 2 masts. Watson's boat, the Blade, only had 1 mast. In addition, the boat was described as being made of timber and having a thick blue stripe on the hull. Watson's boat was neither made of timber or had a blue stripe. The cops also found it suspicious that the boat had been cleaned and painted. However, it was found that the paint had been purchased weeks before the murders. How about the hairs? As I mentioned before, it's almost impossible to come back from a DNA match. Well, if you can believe it, the bag containing the hair samples had a 1-centimeter hole in it, leading to speculation of contamination. The police not only did DNA testing, but mitochondrial DNA testing. The latter returned less than convincing results. However, the prosecution admitted it as evidence of a match anyway. Okay, so what about the 2 inmates that said that Watson confessed to them in jail? Well, it turns out that one of them was receiving death threats from a gang member in prison and was coming up for parole. According to the inmate, police had visited him 10 times over the year before the trial, pressuring him to make false accusations. And he ended up doing so, believing the police could save him from the gang member. The other inmate was found to never have shared a cell with Watson in prison and couldn't have formed any kind of relationship with him. It was revealed that he was granted the use of a car and phone in exchange for his testimony. Remember, this was the evidence that the whole case hinged on, and apparently, it was all made up. And all of this was bad enough, but during the investigation, the media was allowed to report on the case, even naming Watson as the main suspect. They plastered his face all over the papers, spread horrible rumors about him and his family, and painted him as a guilty man before the jury was even selected, ruining his chance for a fair trial. As anyone in this situation would do, Scott Watson immediately started his appeal process on the grounds of the second trip theory. This was the prosecution's story about Watson traveling back to shore but didn't know how he got there. However, courts rejected the appeal, stating that there was no new evidence that would warrant a new trial. In 2009, Watson applied to the Governor General for a royal prerogative of mercy. This is used to change any sentence or penalty in the courts. In his application, he included the book Trial by Trickery and a documentary, Murder on the Blade, both centering around the investigation and conviction of Watson himself. Sadly, this application was rejected as quickly as the appeal was. Then, in 2020, Watson started another appeal process. this time citing the mishandling and contamination of the hairs found on the blade, in addition to the unreliability of the eyewitness accounts. And miraculously, after 4 years of delays, his retrial began in June of 2024. During the trial, the defense cited the multiple eyewitnesses that were coerced by police to give a false identification of Watson. In addition, the media reporting from months before the trial influenced other eyewitness accounts. This trial is still ongoing, and the Court of Appeal could take several months to reach a decision. But what is the right decision? Was Scott Watson an innocent bystander that was in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was he the mastermind behind a devious double murder? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to see some other video on some weird stuff, check these out. Thanks for watching, everyone. I will see you next time.